Right, so this is an interesting proposal that news has broken on today, as it appears Malaysia, who have for quite some time been openly critical of Israel's invasion of Gaza and the atrocities they have committed since, look to have found a way, perhaps, maybe, via a draft resolution of getting Israel expelled from the UN. Now, I, like many others, I dare say, have been of the view that this just isn't possible, would not be possible, since expulsion of a UN member state requires the actions of the UN Security Council, doesn't it? And with the US using their veto on that body in perpetuity to shield Israel from any form of censure, that perhaps suspension of being able to sit at the General Assembly, barred from voting and the like, as was done to apartheid South Africa, was a likelier possibility. But maybe that isn't the point. Maybe if it were to fail due to requiring UN Security Council approval, it would just shine a light again on the unforgivable nature of nations like the US and the UK. And one notable reason for that is the basis that Malaysia's not yet published resolution will be allegedly formed upon. But that is really only half the story where the UK's ongoing shamelessness here is concerned. There's a double whammy for them, a sting in the tail at the end of this video, should they choose to yet again take Israel's side and do so over the UN itself. Right, so Malaysia, very, very critical of Israel. They've had enough, and a resolution has now been drafted and is currently being examined by lawmakers, poring over the wording to present to the UN soon in order to have Israel expelled as a member state. Now, for as long as the UN Security Council is the decision-making body there, such a move, as far as I can see it, doomed to fail, because the United States will almost certainly veto it. However, I'm going to row back on being 100% certain on that because of the apparent basis for Malaysia's resolution, which I'll come on to in a moment. First, here's an excerpt on what is still a breaking news story, really, though naturally is still yet to be picked up in any UK media outlet. So this has been taken from the South China Morning Post. Malaysia will seek the support of Arab nations at an emergency summit next week for a proposal to expel Israel from the United Nations, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim told lawmakers, accusing it of violating international law and UN directives in its unrelenting war on Gaza. More than 43,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed and much of Gaza levelled since Israel launched its war in October last year after a Hamas attack killed 1,200 people on its territory. Muslim-majority Malaysia has been a vocal critic of Israel's assault on Gaza, banning the entry of Israeli shipping giant Zim, while Malaysians have been actively boycotting businesses perceived to be linked to the US, Israel's principal ally and arms supplier. Anwar, who has led the outcry, said Malaysia stood firm in its support for the Palestinians to establish their sovereign state free of the dispossession, terrorism, cruelty and genocide committed by Israel. Anwar said he would present the measure at an emergency summit convened by the Arab League in Riyadh next Monday. Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry said last week that the Arab Islamic Summit would address Israel's continued crimes of violations in Gaza and its expansion of military strikes in Lebanon. Malaysia really have taken the Israel-Palestine situation incredibly seriously. That excerpt mentioned BDS by Malaysians against Israel-centric businesses, notably US ones. But that really does gloss over some of the damage being done in the name of Israeli support to some companies. Starbucks, for example, has just closed 100 stores in Malaysia, though they deny this has been down to anything to do with BDS. They claim it's just restructuring, a bit of rewiring. But the reality is they've lost some 35% of their sales volume over the last year in Malaysia. And all of it stems apparently from the company suing a trade union who is representing a group of their workers, Starbucks workers, who showed solidarity with one of their number who made a social media post expressing support for Palestine. It's caused global problems for them. No sympathy at all from such a tiny instance, a social media post. But in Malaysia, that cost appears to be particularly severe. Now, that excerpt also mentioned that a meeting of the Arab League is being convened, an emergency meeting of, as you might expect, majority Muslim states as that is, in order to gain support for the presentation of this resolution. So clearly this isn't going to come out suddenly later this week. Yes, it's being expedited, but it's being done right, because they know they only have the slimmest of slim chances to pull this off, and they can't afford to give the US an out based on a technicality. As such, the evidence needs to be there to prove that persistent violations of international laws have been committed. If they're going to veto this, as I would imagine most people would widely expect, they need to own the shame that follows. And there's another thing that Malaysia also needs to evidence irrefutable proof of, which brings me onto the basis of this resolution and why it may have the slimmest sliver of a chance of succeeding, and that is persistent violations of UN rulings and decisions. How bad would it look if Malaysia managed to present a resolution to the United Nations Security Council, evidencing that the Council's own decisions have been thrown back in their faces, dismissed, ignored, violated, whatever your adjective of choice might be to describe it, and the US still vetoes the resolution? That would be a veto that would basically say that their loyalty and defence and protection of Israel counts for more than UN decisions do, which would make the United States' position on the UN Security Council untenable, despite being a permanent member. And I'll come back to that point presently. The basis for Malaysia making this move now follows Israel's Knesset ruling that has now officially banned UNRWA from carrying out its humanitarian aid duties, go about its UN-mandated business to deliver aid via Israel to the occupied Palestinian territories. This, of course, has followed the tens of UNRWA worker deaths that Israel has perpetrated, not to mention the attempt already to bankrupt the agency after making up a pack of lies that they were all Hamas, despite providing no evidence whatsoever for any of that, and now they've effectively pulled the same stunt again, only this time voting in their parliament to just boot UNRWA out of their country in defiance of UN rulings, as they are expected to adhere to as a UN member state. So this is what the US will have before it when this resolution comes to the UN Security Council. Are you with Israel or are you with UNRWA? Well, we can hazard a guess where that will probably go, but my God, the optics of picking Israel and their genocide over the aid agency helping their innocent victims. You can hear the global demands for the US's removal from the UN Security Council ringing in your ears already. Fanciful talk, though, you might say, Damo, but actually, that might not be completely true. And this is why I wouldn't give my 100% backing to this failing. You see, to throw a state out of the UN, it has to be voted on by the UN General Assembly after the UN Security Council agree unanimously. That's the bit we don't expect to happen to Israel. But what if it were the US instead? Can it veto its own expulsion, being a permanent security member, or even can it veto over Israel, just be ignored, if it's just too much now, too much of a global piss take to accept such a decision being vetoed again? There does appear to be a route whereby the UN General Assembly can take a vote regardless of what the Security Council say, and it's something I found on the website of Lawfare Media. The article in question posits the expulsion of Russia from the UN, but Russia is also a permanent Security Council member state. And it comes down to UN Charter Article 4 and a discussion of the ICJ from the 1960s. Article 4, if you're not familiar with it, it reads, 1. Membership in the United Nations is open to all other peace-loving states which accept the obligations contained in the present Charter and in the judgment of the organisation are able and willing to carry out these obligations. And 2. The admission of any such state to membership in the United Nations will be affected by a decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Recommendation, key word there. This places conditionality upon UN membership as well, though, that the member state abide by UN decisions and not violate them, allow their obligations to be carried out, help those obligations be carried out, very much summing up UNRWA's work, and that by blocking UNRWA, the member state would be, therefore, in direct violation of the UN Charter itself. That's not the UN Security Council's remit to obstruct, or at least if it tries to, if it does, it keeps open the door for their position to be challenged, since their decisions appear to just be recommendations, though perhaps it would involve a court case, I dare say. About that court, though, the ICJ. Back in 1962, yeah, all that way back, they came to an advisory ruling concerning the cost of operations going on at that point in the Congo and, surprise, surprise, the Middle East, and whether to apportion it across all member states, that cost. You can read the whole story on Lawfare Media's website. I'm not going to go into it all here. But the ICJ determined that the cost should be apportioned across all member states in relation to those issues. It was effectively a clarification of Article 17 of the UN Charter as that was. But it was one paragraph of their findings that mattered most in this case, and it read, in connection with the suspension of rights and privileges of membership and expulsion from membership under Articles 5 and 6, it is the Security Council which has only the power to recommend, and it is the General Assembly which decides and whose decision determines status. But there is a close collaboration between the two organs. So the General Assembly, according to that albeit advisory opinion, but also Article 4, can overrule the Security Council, who apparently can only make recommendations. I would still expect this to go to court, but surely there's precedent here, both in an advisory capacity and within the UN Charter itself. So who knows which way that would swing? Ought to go the way of the UN. Surely. As for where the UK getting shamed in all of this comes in, well, the timing of when the resolution being presented by Malaysia going before the UN Security Council will mean the monthly rotation of who will have to chair this issue amongst current Security Council member states means it will be the UK's turn to take the chair. So the UK will be presiding over this. And them taking the cowardly abstention way out of this after directing the debate? That'll look worse than every one of their other previous abstentions when it came to Israel, won't it? As if the issue of abstaining over UNRWA being rendered illegal arbitrarily by a rogue member state wouldn't be bad enough as it was. The UN will have a choice if the US does, as it always does, and raises that hand of veto once again. Step up, finally, and do what you came together to do. Do what you have a remit to do. Or let one rogue state protect another and damn your reputation further in the eyes of the world. Will it take other states leaving the UN in disgust to elicit some action as demanded by the rest of the world, and the actual people living in it, not being represented by their leaders right now? Meanwhile, as the US goes to the polls today to pick their next president, seemingly on the basis of which one will protect Israel's right to commit genocide further, between which one smiles and which one won't, they are seemingly imposing new restrictions regarding medical assistance being accessible to those in need in Lebanon, escaping more of Israel's atrocity, by demanding they go through their pre-approved checkpoint in Jordan only, where the CIA will be waiting for them. It's all about Hezbollah, not health, isn't it? Just who is in charge? Get the details of that story in this video recommendation here and your suggested next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.